Some monsters don't hide in shadows. Some live in apartments with yellowed carpets, cluttered kitchens, and the faint smell of bleach. Some offer you a drink, a smile, maybe a photograph. And when the door closes, silence swallows you whole. His name is Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. To the world, he became the Milwaukee Cannibal. To criminal psychology, he is one of the most unsettling studies in how obsession, fantasy, and control can evolve into cruelty so profound it redefines horror itself. Childhood shadows, seeds of obsession. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in West Allis, Wisconsin, to a family already vibrating with tension. His father, Lionel, was an analytical man, often absent, and his mother, Joyce, struggled with depression and prescription drug dependency. Their fights carved silence into the walls of the Dahmer household. From an early age, Jeffrey showed what psychologists call precursors, behaviors that hint at a fascination with death. He collected animal bones, not just out of curiosity, but with reverence. He once described the sound of bones clicking together as fascinating, almost musical. Criminal psychology has long noted this link. For some children, dissection is a step towards science. For Dahmer, it was a rehearsal. By adolescence, Jeffrey's loneliness hardened. He was shy, awkward, often drunk before class. Alcohol became his way of numbing urges he didn't understand, urges that blended sexuality with imagery of corpses. For most teenagers, fantasy is a rehearsal for intimacy. For Jeffrey, fantasy became a rehearsal for cruelty. The first kill, 1978. After high school graduation, Dahmer committed his first murder. His parents' marriage had collapsed, his house was nearly empty, and he was utterly alone. On June 18, 1978, Dahmer picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks, offering him a ride and a few beers. Inside the house, conversation turned awkward. Jeffrey feared Stephen would leave, and with that departure, his fantasy would evaporate. In desperation, he grabbed a dumbbell and struck him from behind. He strangled Stephen, then dismembered him. Criminal psychology sees this moment as the critical fracture. Jeffrey's obsession was no longer confined to fantasy. The act of murder delivered what psychologists call reinforcement, the relief of anxiety, the gratification of desire, the cementing of a ritual. Dahmer had crossed the line from thought to method. Dormant years, fantasy and isolation. For nearly a decade, Dahmer killed no one. He joined the army but was discharged for alcoholism. He drifted, arrested for indecent exposure, petty theft. On the surface, he was failing, but internally, his fantasies grew sharper. He frequented gay bars, bathhouses, bookstores. He drugged men not to kill them, but to keep them immobile, silent, compliant. The criminal psychologist Robert Ressler, one of the FBI's pioneers in profiling, later said Dahmer's case illustrated the compulsion of control, the desire not just to be with someone, but to own them completely. When control through drugs no longer satisfied, Dahmer escalated again. The Apartment of Horrors, 1990s. By the 1990s, Dahmer lived in apartment 213 of the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee. Neighbors complained of strange odors. He explained them away: rotten meat, bad plumbing. The lies were polite, believable, almost banal. Inside, the apartment was a crime scene in progress. A refrigerator held a severed head. Freezers contained wrapped packages of flesh. Acid barrels sat in the corner, filled with dissolving remains. Polaroid photos documented every stage: the body alive, the body unconscious, the body dismantled. This is where criminal psychology sees Dahmer's cruelty as uniquely ritualized. For Dahmer, murder was not an end, it was maintenance. He sought to create a zombie, a submissive, permanent partner. He drilled holes into victims' skulls and poured in boiling water or acid, attempting to erase their will without erasing their bodies. The clinical cruelty of this act reveals the chilling intersection of sexuality, science, and sadism. When that failed, cannibalism became his solution. By consuming parts of his victims, Dahmer believed he could keep them with him forever. Cannibalism, in his mind, was not savagery, it was intimacy. This is perhaps the most terrifying insight criminal psychology offers, that cruelty can wear the mask of love. The victims, the miscounted Dahmer's victims, were often young men of color, Black, Asian, Latino, drawn from marginalized communities where disappearances didn't always trigger urgent police response. Here, the psychology of cruelty intersects with the failures of society. Many of the victims trusted Dahmer because he offered kindness where the world offered suspicion. He promised money, alcohol, or photography work. In their final hours, they encountered not rage, but reassurance. And that calm voice, that neat apartment, became their last mistake. Criminal psychology teaches that serial killers exploit the availability of victims. Dahmer's cruelty was not just in what he did, but in who he chose. The men society already overlooked. Capture, July 22nd, 1991. Dahmer's crimes might have continued if not for one man, Tracy Edwards. Edwards managed to escape Dahmer's apartment, running through the streets with a handcuff dangling from his wrist. Police followed him back to apartment 2 and 13. What they found was beyond comprehension. A freezer filled with human remains, photographs cataloging dismemberment, barrels of acid, skull-lined shelves. When interrogated, Dahmer did not rant. He confessed with chilling clarity, describing each murder as though he were listing chores. "It was my way of remembering," he explained, "my way of keeping them." This lack of emotional affect, the absence of visible guilt, fits the profile of what psychologists call affective blunting. Dahmer knew what he did was wrong in the legal sense, but emotionally, he experienced none of the moral barriers that stop ordinary people. His cruelty was not impulsive, it was structured. Trial and imprisonment. At trial, Dahmer's defense raised questions of insanity. Could a man who drilled into skulls and ate flesh truly understand morality? The jury thought so. Dahmer was found legally sane and sentenced to 15 life terms, 957 years in prison. Psychologists testified that Dahmer exhibited paraphilias, necrophilia, cannibalism, sadism. But beneath all of them was the same psychological current, the need for control. His murders were not about rage, but about possession, turning people into objects, partners who would never leave. In prison, Dahmer seemed subdued, even cooperative. He spoke in interviews about his faith, about regret, but always with a flatness that unnerved. In 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate. Some called it justice, others called it irony, that a man obsessed with control would die in chaos. Criminal psychology of Dahmer, the cruelty of obsession. Jeffrey Dahmer's story teaches criminal psychology a brutal lesson. Cruelty does not always come from rage. Sometimes it comes from loneliness. Sometimes it comes from fantasies rehearsed until reality bends to match them. His cruelty was not theatrical, it was methodical, but now almost bureaucratic. Kill, photograph, dismember, store, consume, repeat. In this way, Dahmer represents what psychologists call ritualistic reinforcement, each act feeding the next, each cruelty making the next easier. Cannibalism for Dahmer was not hunger, it was ownership. Necrophilia was not lust, it was permanence. And murder was not violence, it was maintenance. This inversion of meaning is what makes Dahmer one of the most terrifying serial killers in criminal psychology. He did not just destroy bodies, he rewrote intimacy into annihilation. Jeffrey Dahmer was not a monster in appearance. He was a man who smiled, worked, walked among neighbors, but inside he carried a laboratory of fantasies where cruelty became routine. Criminal psychology warns us that killers like Dahmer thrive not because they are inhuman, but because they are so human it frightens us. He wanted possession. He wanted permanence. And in his pursuit, he left behind one of the darkest case studies in the history of serial killers. Some killers leave behind brutality that speaks for itself, but others build their crimes out of silence, out of secrecy, out of systems that don't want to see. In the Soviet Union of the 1970s and 1980s, one man turned forests, train stations, and dirt paths into slaughterhouses. He was called the Butcher of Rostov. His real name was Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. To his neighbors, he was a teacher, a husband, a quiet intellectual. To criminal psychology, he remains one of the most terrifying case studies in how repression, humiliation, and control can ferment into cruelty so profound it scars generations. Childhood of hunger and humiliation. Andrei Chikatilo was born in 1936 in Ukraine, a land starved by Stalin's Holodomor famine. Hunger was not abstract for him. It was physical, gnawing, permanent. Stories in his village told of neighbors who resorted to cannibalism. His own brother, some said, had been stolen and eaten. Psychologists point to this formative environment of deprivation as crucial. When a child grows up in constant fear of starvation, survival becomes an obsession. But Chikatilo's scars went deeper. He was frail, shy, mocked by other children. He suffered from a neurosis, bedwetting, that compounded his shame. Most devastating of all, he struggled with impotence throughout adolescence. In a society that prized stoic masculinity, this failure carved humiliation into his identity. Humiliation, criminal psychology teaches, is one of the darkest fuels for cruelty. Where self-esteem collapses, the desire to dominate others often takes root. The mask of a teacher. In adulthood, Chikatilo studied literature and became a teacher. To the outside world, he was eccentric but harmless, tall, bespectacled, awkward. But his students remembered something different. The way his eyes lingered too long, the way he touched too close. He often groped children, mostly girls, sometimes boys. Complaints reached administrators, but in the Soviet system, exposure of such scandals was dangerous. He was simply reassigned. Criminal psychology identifies this pattern often. Institutions protect themselves instead of victims, giving predators new hunting grounds. For Chikatilo, each escape reinforced the lesson that secrecy worked, that the mask of authority could shield the monster within. The first murder, 1978. On December 22, 1978, Chikatilo lured a 9-year-old girl named Yelena into a shed. What followed was a catastrophic fusion of his deepest humiliations. He stabbed her, mutilated her, and in the frenzy, achieved orgasm for the first time in his life. For him, violence became a solution to impotence. Criminal psychologists describe this as sadistic arousal, when control and cruelty replace intimacy. For Chikatilo, it was not sex that gave him release, it was blood. He had found his ritual, and rituals once discovered rarely fade. A killing routine. Across Rostov, over the next decade and a half, Chikatilo murdered more than 50 people. Children, teenagers, young women, even boys. He prowled bus stations and train depots, choosing the vulnerable, runaways, orphans, students returning home. His method followed a pattern. He lured them with promises of food, money, or safety. Once secluded, he attacked with knives, ropes, even his bare hands. The murders were frenzied, often involving mutilation, eyes gouged, genitals removed, flesh bitten. Each wound was not random, but ritualistic, tied to his warped psychology of release. Criminal psychology sees here what's called overkill, violence far beyond what is needed to kill. Overkill often signals deep emotional displacement, rage redirected from self to victim. For Chikatilo, every knife wound was an exorcism of his own shame. The Soviet blind spot. For years, the murders baffled authorities. The Soviet Union was reluctant to admit a serial killer existed at all. After all, serial murder was framed as a Western disease, not a socialist one. Files were mismanaged, suspects were tortured into confessions, and innocent men were executed while Chikatilo roamed free. Psychologists argue this systemic denial fed Chikatilo's success. He thrived in the blind spot of bureaucracy, where ideology mattered more than truth. Each failure of the state reinforced his sense of invincibility. The psychology of cruelty. To understand Chikatilo is to confront the psychology of cruelty itself. Unlike killers who hide their sadism, he escalated into grotesque mutilation, often post-mortem. Criminal psychologists have debated why he gouged out the eyes of the victims. Some suggest superstition, that he feared the dead could see him. Others argue it was symbolic, destroying the gaze of those who might judge him. Every act was an externalization of his internal fractures. His impotence became their mutilation. His humiliation became their silence. His hunger became their dismemberment. Unlike Dahmer, who sought possession, Chikatilo sought annihilation. His killings were not about keeping victims. They were about erasing them, turning bodies into expressions of rage that words could never contain. The net closes. By the late 1980s, the bodies had piled too high to ignore. Task forces were assembled. Undercover agents patrolled stations. In 1990, police spotted Chikatilo behaving suspiciously near a Rostov train station, speaking to young boys, his clothes muddy, his fingers cut. When searched, he carried rope and a knife. Though initially released, surveillance and evidence mounted. Soon after, he was arrested and confronted with forensic links to multiple murders. The confession, a horror in words. What shocked interrogators most was not just Chikatilo's confession, but the way he gave it. He described each killing with clinical precision, sometimes pride. He admitted to stabbing, biting, even tasting flesh. His voice was calm, detached, as if narrating chores. Criminal psychology calls this affective flattening, a lack of emotional resonance. But behind his flatness was something worse: enjoyment. The killings were not burdens, they were rehearsals perfected. His confessions stretched for days, producing hundreds of pages. He reenacted murders for police at crime scenes, smiling, gesturing like a teacher delivering a lesson. Trial and the monster. Unmasked, Chikatilo's trial in 1992 was a spectacle. Caged inside a steel enclosure in the courtroom, he appeared disheveled, ranting at times, calm at others. Families of victims screamed for his death. Psychiatrists debated his sanity. Was he schizophrenic, a sexual sadist, a psychopath? Ultimately, he was declared sane enough to stand trial. He was convicted of 52 murders, though many suspect his toll was higher. In February 1994, he was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. His last words were defiant, not remorseful. Criminal Psychology of Chikatilo, The Anatomy of Sadism. Andrei Chikatilo embodies what criminal psychology defines as compensatory sadism. His impotence and humiliation became the seed of his violence. Where ordinary intimacy failed him, brutality delivered release. Psychologists stress that Chikatilo's cruelty was not random. It was patterned, ritualized, an attempt to rewrite his fractured masculinity through domination. Unlike killers driven by profit or passion, he was driven by compulsion. The need to recreate the scene of his first release, again and again, with escalating frenzy. His case also illustrates how social and political denial can fuel serial crime. By refusing to name the threat, Soviet authorities gave him years of freedom. He thrived not just because of psychology, but because of silence. Andrei Chikatilo killed not in shadows, but in the blind spots of a nation that refused to see. His crimes were not just acts of cruelty, they were the echoes of humiliation, turned outward with a knife. In criminal psychology, he remains one of the darkest figures. Not because he was inhuman, but because his violence was so human in its origins. Hunger, shame, desire, rage. He was the teacher, he was the neighbor, he was the father. And behind those masks, he was the butcher of Rostov. Find, torture, kill. 3 words carved not in blood, but in letters mailed to police and newspapers. 3 words that became the calling card of one of America's most unsettling predators. Dennis Lynn Rader looked like a neighbor, a husband, a church leader. He worked a 9-to-5 job, cared for his lawn, enforced dog ordinances as a compliance officer. But behind the mask of suburban respectability was a man who built his identity on control. Control over bodies, control over narratives, control over fear itself. This is the story of the BTK killer. And in the language of criminal psychology, it is the study of sadism performed as theater. Early life, the roots of control. Rader was born in 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and raised in Wichita, the heartland of America. Outwardly, he was ordinary, the eldest of 4 brothers in a working-class family. But early warning signs, later emphasized by psychologists, emerged quickly. As a child, Rader engaged in what experts call the McDonald triad: cruelty to animals, fire-setting, and obsessive fantasies of bondage. He strangled cats and dogs, not in rage, but methodically, watching them struggle, fascinated by the moment life surrendered to control. He also developed a deep fixation on women's underwear, stealing garments, and imagining scenarios of captivity and domination. Psychologists describe this stage as the fusion of sexual arousal with power and pain. For Rader, arousal did not exist apart from control. The seed was planted. Sex, death, and ritual would always be intertwined. The double life. Respectable mask, hidden fantasies. Like many serial killers, Rader learned to wear masks. He married, had 2 children, served in the Air Force, and eventually worked for ADT Security, installing alarm systems. An ironic profession, given how often he broke into homes. He was active in church, even president of his congregation. Neighbors described him as serious, disciplined, boringly normal. But beneath this exterior was a constant rehearsal of bondage fantasies. He kept hit kits, bags with ropes, tape, knives, and gloves. He stalked potential victims for weeks, writing notes, sketching floor plans, and logging what he called projects. Criminal psychology identifies this behavior as compartmentalization, the ability to maintain 2 selves, one socially compliant, the other sadistically obsessive. The mask wasn't accidental, it was part of his ritual. Respectability provided camouflage. The Otero murders, 1974. On January 15, 1974, Rader chose the Otero family as his first public performance. Inside their Wichita home, he bound Joseph and Julie Otero and 2 of their children, 9-year-old Joseph Jr. and 11-year-old Josephine. He tortured and strangled them one by one. What stands out in criminal psychology is not just the brutality, but the staging. Rader left bodies arranged, ropes carefully tied. He lingered to observe his work. Later, he admitted that Josephine's hanging was the centerpiece of his arousal. Rader didn't just kill. He rehearsed fantasies of domination until they became choreography. Sadism was his art, and murder was his canvas. Letters to the World, the birth of BTK. Unlike Dahmer, who tried to hide, Rader craved recognition. Months after the Otero murders, he mailed a letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper, detailing his crimes. In chilling, almost bureaucratic prose, he introduced himself. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. Here, psychology sees a man not just killing, but branding himself. Rader needed an audience. He sought not only physical control of victims, but psychological control of the community. Fear itself became his second victim. The ritual. Murders of the 1970s, 80s. Through the late 1970s and 1980s, Rader murdered multiple women, often in their homes, sometimes in secluded areas. His victims were chosen carefully. Women he stalked, observed, studied, until they became characters in his fantasies. He bound them with ropes or nylons, gagged them, tortured them, and strangled them slowly, often with sexual gratification linked directly to their suffering. He took souvenirs, underwear, jewelry, Polaroids. Psychologists classify BTK as a sexual sadist and an organized offender. His crime scenes showed planning, control, and deliberate staging. Unlike impulsive killers, Rader rehearsed cruelty like a performance, repeating motifs: rope, bondage, slow strangulation. Each crime was both a killing and a play, scripted in his mind long before the victim ever saw him. Control through fear. Letters, media, and ego Rader's cruelty extended beyond physical acts. He wrote taunting letters to police, filled with riddles and demands. He craved acknowledgement of his cleverness. He styled himself as the director of Wichita's fear. This is where criminal psychology introduces the concept of narcissistic sadism, the need not only to dominate victims but to dominate perception. For Rader, murders weren't enough. He needed headlines. He needed the initials BTK to echo in every household. Dormancy, The Mask. Titans after 1991, BTK seemed to vanish. Rader took on new roles: church president, Boy Scout troop leader, father of two. But the fantasies never stopped. He continued to write stories, draw bondage sketches, and photograph himself tied up, dressed in women's underwear, reenacting his crimes. Criminal psychologists emphasize this as ritual reinforcement. Even in absence of murder, the rituals of fantasy maintained his compulsions. He was never cured, he was simply waiting. The Fatal Flaw, 2004 to 2005. Decades passed, and BTK became legend. But Rader couldn't stay silent. In 2004, he resumed sending packages and letters to media and police. He wanted recognition again. In one infamous exchange, Rader asked police if a floppy disk could be traced. Detectives replied, falsely, that it could not. When Rader sent a disk, metadata revealed it came from a computer at Christ Lutheran Church, linked to Dennis Rader. For all his planning, his narcissism betrayed him. Criminal psychology calls this the ego trap. Killers who believe they are too clever to be caught often create their own undoing. The Arrest, the Monster Unmasked. On February 25, 2005, police arrested Dennis Rader during a traffic stop. In custody, he confessed with chilling composure. He detailed each murder like items in a catalog, explaining ropes, knots, positions, and his feelings during the acts. What shocked interrogators was his flatness. He was neither raging nor remorseful. He spoke as if giving a PowerPoint presentation, even smiling at times. Psychologists call this effective blunting, combined with narcissistic pride. Rader relished explaining his projects. In his mind, he wasn't just confessing, he was lecturing, preserving his performance for history. Trial and sentencing. At trial, Rader pleaded guilty to 10 murders. He described each in graphic detail, horrifying families in court. He mimicked the victims' last moments, demonstrating knots and bindings. The cruelty here was not just in the crimes, but in the retelling. Psychologists note that recounting crimes often reactivates arousal in sadists. Rader's casual tone revealed that even memory was enough to fuel his rituals. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. He is imprisoned to this day, writing letters, occasionally granting interviews, still savoring the role of BTK. Criminal Psychology of BTK, Sadism as Theater. What makes Dennis Rader distinct in the world of serial killers is not only his cruelty, but his performance of cruelty. Sadistic ritual. Every killing was staged as bondage, torture, and slow death, his personal script. Control. Beyond death. He controlled victims in life and controlled Wichita in fear. The mask of normalcy. By day, he was a church leader, by night, a predator, proof of extreme compartmentalization. Narcissism, his need for attention, letters, and headlines eventually destroyed him. Criminal psychology teaches that sadists like Rader do not just crave control, they crave audience. BTK reminds us that some killers do not hide in shadows. They build theaters and force the world to watch. Dennis Rader bound his victims, tortured them, killed them. But his real obsession was never just the act. It was the performance, the thrill of control, the applause of fear, the script of a life built on cruelty. He wanted to be remembered as BTK. And in the annals of criminal psychology, he is remembered not only for the horror of his crimes, but for the lesson his narcissism teaches. Monsters don't always lurk outside. Sometimes they lead prayers, mow lawns, and write their own headlines. Not all serial killers hide behind rage or ritual. Some hide behind a smile. Some lure with politeness, intelligence, and the illusion of safety. Ted Bundy was not remembered for brutality alone, though his brutality was staggering, but for the mask he wore while committing it. Bundy's story is not just about murder, it is about manipulation, about how deception becomes a weapon sharper than any knife. In criminal psychology, his case is one of the most enduring lessons in the danger of appearances, how a killer can look like a savior, how charm itself can be camouflage. The early life, a patchwork of lies. Theodore Robert Bundy was born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, to an unwed mother, raised initially believing his grandparents were his parents, and his mother was his sister. This early web of deception shaped him deeply. Psychologists argue that such unstable identities can fracture a child's developing sense of truth and trust. Bundy grew into a clever, articulate, and handsome young man. Outwardly, he was a law student, a political volunteer, even described as charismatic. But beneath this facade was profound insecurity. He struggled with rejection, especially from women who reminded him of his first serious girlfriend, a woman whose eventual rejection would echo through his crimes. Criminal psychology often cites Bundy as the embodiment of narcissistic psychopathy, superficially charming, but devoid of empathy. For Bundy, charm wasn't a trait, it was a tool. The method, charm as bait. Bundy's murders began in earnest in the mid-1970s. Unlike killers who stalked from shadows, Bundy approached victims in broad daylight. He pretended to be injured, wearing a fake cast, hobbling on crutches, or posed as an authority figure like a police officer. Women, socialized to help, offered him assistance. That was when he struck. He lured them to his car, a modest Volkswagen Beetle, and attacked. Many were bludgeoned, strangled, and later subjected to necrophilic acts. Bundy returned to some victims' bodies, grooming them like dolls, performing rituals of control long after death. What made Bundy terrifying was not just the violence, but the psychological seduction. Victims didn't see rage in his eyes. They saw need, vulnerability, kindness. Criminal psychology identifies this as impression management, the deliberate construction of a persona to manipulate trust. The victim profile, reflections of rejection. Bundy's victims were often young, attractive women with long hair parted in the middle. Psychologists believe this fixation mirrored his first girlfriend, whose rejection devastated him. Every victim became a proxy, a chance to reenact and rewrite humiliation. But cruelty was more than revenge. For Bundy, domination itself was intoxicating. He later admitted that killing gave him possession of his victims in a way relationships never could. This mirrors the psychological phenomenon of objectification through violence, where victims cease to be people and become extensions of the killer's inner script. The wave of fear, the 1970s murders. By 1974, Bundy's killings had escalated into a frenzy. Women disappeared from college campuses in Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. In one audacious double attack at Lake Sammamish State Park, he abducted 2 women on the same day, in full view of crowds. He introduced himself openly as Ted. Witnesses described him as handsome, polite, carrying a cast. Police now had a suspect with a name, but Bundy's normalcy was so disarming, few believed he could be the monster they sought. Psychologists note this as cognitive dissonance. When reality clashes with perception, people don't want to believe that danger looks like the boy next door. The mask of normalcy, law, politics, and family. Bundy maintained a dual identity. He studied law, volunteered for political campaigns, and dated women who described him as attentive and gentle. He even worked at a suicide hotline alongside Anne Rule, who later wrote, "The Stranger Beside Me." Rule herself admitted she couldn't reconcile the caring colleague with the killer he became. This is where Bundy's psychology is most chilling. Unlike killers who tried to hide, Bundy thrived in visibility. He weaponized trust, knowing his charm was a stronger disguise than any mask. The escapes, control through chaos. Bundy was arrested in 1975 after suspicious behavior led police to search his car, finding handcuffs, rope, and masks. But even in custody, his obsession with control played out. He escaped not once, but twice. In 1977, he jumped from a courthouse window during a hearing, surviving on the run for 6 days. Later that year, he escaped again, slipping through a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell and vanishing into the night. Criminal psychology views these escapes as extensions of Bundy's narcissistic belief in invulnerability. He saw himself not as a prisoner, but as the author of his own narrative. The Florida Murders, Final Frenzy. In Florida, Bundy's violence reached its peak. In 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University and brutally attacked 4 women, killing 2, bludgeoning them with a log. Hours later, he assaulted another student nearby. This frenzy showed what psychologists call decompensation, the breakdown of control, where rituals no longer satisfy and compulsion accelerates. Bundy was no longer the calm manipulator. He was unraveling. Later that year, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, sealing his fate. Trial as Theater, 1979. Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders became the first televised trial of its kind, turning him into a grim celebrity. He defended himself in court, smiling for cameras, flirting with women, even proposing marriage to a witness on the stand. Psychologists identify this as grandiose narcissism. Bundy wasn't just defending himself, he was performing. The trial wasn't about justice, it was about spotlight. Despite his performance, the evidence was overwhelming. Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death. Confession and execution. In the years before his execution, Bundy finally confessed to over 30 murders, though the true number remains unknown. He spoke of compulsion, of fantasies that demanded reenactment, of control he could never resist. On January 24, 1989, Bundy was executed in the electric chair. Outside, crowds cheered, holding signs that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn." Even in death, Bundy remained a paradox, a man remembered as much for his smile as for his savagery. Criminal Psychology of Bundy, The Mask of Charm. Bundy's legacy in criminal psychology is profound. Charm as weapon. He showed that serial killers need not be grotesque. They can be attractive, articulate, and socially adept. Sadism through deception. His cruelty wasn't just in killing, it was in the manipulation that led victims to walk willingly into his trap. Narcissistic grandiosity. He believed he was smarter than investigators, stronger than the system, invulnerable to consequence. The danger of appearances. Bundy forces us to confront that evil often wears a smile. Ted Bundy was not the man in the shadows. He was the man in the daylight, the one who asked for help, the one who smiled. His psychology reminds us that serial killers don't just wield knives, they wield charm, deception, and the very instincts of kindness we are taught to trust. Bundy's cruelty was not just in what he did to bodies, it was in what he did to truth itself. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying deception of all.